from every corner of the globe. Marketplace, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Middle East. With CNNBusiness.com.
Once-in-a-generation opportunity.
Technology, innovation, business.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Live from CNN London, this is Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
Well, questions mounting about law enforcement's response to the horrific Uvalde massacre. How did a teen with an assault-style rifle walk into an unlocked elementary school and stay for nearly an hour before turning it into a killing field? We will explore that ahead this hour. Also, more than 30 leading experts accuse Russia of genocide in Ukraine in the first independent legal report. We're going to speak to one of its authors about accountability and justice. I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. Well, let's begin in Texas, where in about an hour's time, public safety officials will give an update on the deadliest U.S. school shooting in nearly a decade. And later today, the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, is set to speak outside the Uvalde, Texas elementary school. It comes as new questions arise about the police response to the massacre that claimed the lives of 19 children and 2 teachers. We are now learning law enforcement did not confront the 18-year-old gunman before he entered the school. That contradicts what authorities said earlier this week. We are told at least 7 officers rushed inside within 4 minutes of the shooter's arrival, but it's still not clear why it then took nearly an hour to breach the classroom where the 18-year-old had barricaded himself in. New video shows parents, frustrated and angry, confronting police, begging them to enter the school while the attacker was still shooting. Meanwhile, the gunman's own mother speaking out for the first time and pleading for forgiveness.
I have no words. I have no words to say. I don't know what he was thinking. He had his reasons for doing what he did, and please don't judge him. I only want the innocent children who died to forgive me.
What do you tell their families?
Forgive me. Forgive my son. I know he had his reasons.
What reasons could he have had?
To get closer to those children, instead of paying attention to the other bad things. I have no words. I don't know.
We are finally putting names to the names of all of the 21 victims of that massacre as we learn more about each of them. Among them, Miranda Mathis, who was just 11 years old. Her friends describe her as bright and spunky. And 10-year-old Mate Rodriguez's mother says she was a sweet, charismatic, loving, caring, loyal, free, ambitious, funny, silly, goal-driven girl. And her best friend, Mate, wanted to be a marine biologist. And we're also hearing from some of the students and teachers who were at Robb Elementary School when the shooting unfolded and survived. For one, her 11-year-old, Mia Cirillo, it started out like a regular Tuesday. She and her classmates were enjoying a film at their school. Then their lives, well, quite frankly, were turned into a horror show. And the kind where playing dead means staying alive. And that's exactly what Mia did to survive the massacre at the Robb Elementary School. She wants the world to know what she lived through, but she's not keen to talk on camera, and she's not keen to talk to men at this point, so she spoke exclusively to CNN's producer, Nora News, who joins me now live from Uvalde in Texas. Nora, just explain what Mia told you.
If she's talking.
All right. We'll get back to Nora. Meantime, while we establish some communication with her, let's just sit back and consider what happened here. A classroom turned into a killing field. Desperate parents outside begging officers to let them in. The scene almost unfathomable and understandably leaving many with unanswered questions. We are learning more about the timeline of events on Tuesday, but as my colleague Shimon Prokopets reports, confusion and anger are mounting.
Growing outrage as more details emerge about the crucial hour a shooter had barricaded himself in a classroom at Robb Elementary School.
You go in, and that didn't happen here. I don't want to Monday morning quarterback this thing, but at the end of the day, we have to find out for the future so that this never happens again and what kind of failures happen. And I feel in this situation, standing back was not the thing to do.
19 children and 2 teachers were killed in Tuesday's massacre. And new video reveals parents frantic outside the school begging law enforcement to enter.
I told one of the officers myself if they didn't want to go under, let me borrow a gun and a vest and I'll go under myself to handle it up. And they told me no. I mean, they, like I said, they were doing their job, but they could have done it quicker before that man went in the school.
Criticism over the police response is mounting.
Since Columbine, we've known that law enforcement has known that you don't have a second to waste when you're dealing with an active shooter. Police engage the teachers, get the kids out of here, and you hold that ground. You bang it out with them until heavier weapons arrive. Those parents were right.
Further, law enforcement is now backpedaling earlier statements made to the public in the hours after the shooting. On Tuesday, the public was told that the shooter engaged with a school resource officer, but that was not the case.
He was not confronted by anybody. To clear the record on that.
There was no school resource officer at the school when the shooter entered the building. Here's where the timeline of events stands, according to law enforcement. At 11:28 a.m., the gunman crashed his vehicle in a ditch near the school. Onlookers nearby saw the crash and the gunman emerge, weapon in hand.
Came out with an automatic weapon, shot at least twice, maybe 3 times at them, and then that's when he spotted me, and boy, I was already in motion to run, and that's when he, bam, bam.
At 11:40 a.m., the gunman seems to have walked into the school through an unlocked door. Inside, the gunman entered a classroom and fired more than 25 times. At 11:44 a.m., law enforcement entered the school. They immediately received fire and took cover. Officers say the shooter was barricaded in a classroom and they were talking to him. They also called for backup. Officials defending the response to the shooting.
At that point, they had the suspect contained inside the classroom. If those officers weren't there, if they did not maintain their presence, there is a good chance that gunman could have made it to other classrooms and commit more killings.
There is still a crucial hour where details are sparse as to why officers were not able to breach that barricaded classroom and apprehend the gunman.
We will be doing updates. We will be doing updates to answer those questions. What is your name? Shimon. I hear you.
Because we've been given a lot of bad information, so why don't you clear all of this up now and explain to us how it is that your officers were in there for an hour, yes, rescuing people, but yet no one was able to get inside that room.
Shimon, we will circle back with you.
I'll speak to Shimon in a moment, but we've established comms now, communications with our producer, Nora News, who spoke exclusively to an 11-year-old survivor who witnessed the shooting unfold. Mia is her name, and she's not keen to talk to men or on camera, but she does want to share her story, and so she has shared it with you, Nora. What did Mia tell you?
Yeah, 11-year-old Mia Cerrillo was in Miss Garcia and Miss Mireles' classroom. That's the classroom that we've heard so much about. And she said it started off as a really normal day. It's the end of the school year. They were watching the movie Lilo and Stitch because they had already finished their assignments. And they got word that there was a shooter in the building. And so one of her teachers headed over to the door to lock it and said the shooter was right there. And so he shot out the window in the door and then backed the teacher into the classroom. And that's when Mia says things happened really quickly. The shooter approached the teacher, looked her right in the eyes, said good night, and then shot her, killing her.
This is almost too much to hear, really, isn't it? And to hear this from an 11-year-old. Did she go on to explain what happened next?
Yeah, and it honestly just gets worse from here. At that point, the gunman started open firing in the classroom and shot a lot of her friends and the other teacher who was in the classroom. And so the gunman stopped shooting momentarily and went through a door that led to an adjoining classroom. And Mia from her classroom could hear more gunshots, screams from the children in that room. And then when the gunshots stopped, she heard music. And she said the gunman seemed to put on music, and it was sad music. And I said, what kind of music? Can you describe it anymore? And she said it just sounded like I want to kill people music. And at that point, she was scared that the gunman would come back into the room and try to kill her as well. And so, and this is hard to say and hard to hear, she put her hands on the body of her friend next to her who had already died, and then smeared her friend's blood all over her body so that she could play dead if the gunman came back into the room. And it was like that, covered in her friend's blood, surrounded by the bodies of her friends and her teachers who had been killed, that she lay there with her eyes closed for seems about up to an hour until the police entered the building.
She lay for what she believes is up to an hour, smeared in the blood of a dead friend to play dead in case this gunman came back in. These are the words of an 11-year-old speaking to you, Nora. She didn't want to speak on camera, and she didn't want to speak to a man about this, and so she chose to speak to you. I just wonder, having had that conversation with Mia, can you begin to describe what sort of effect that you think this will have on her?
I almost have no words because she was incredibly traumatized, as you can only begin to imagine. And I kept saying to her, you don't have to do this interview. This interview was her idea. They called me. I said, you don't have to do this. And she kept saying, no, I really want to. I really want to tell my story because I think if people knew what it was really like to live through a school shooting, maybe they would do something in the U.S. to prevent this from happening to other kids. Her parents told me, they really want to make sure they can get her some kind of therapy moving forward, and they don't have the financial means to do that. And so they started a GoFundMe page to raise money for her therapy. And I think we actually have that address that we can put on the screen if folks want to help out to pay for this little girl's therapy costs. Physically, she's surprisingly okay. She has some bullets, shrapnel, and fragments still all in her shoulder and her back. I can see it in the back of her head. Some of her hair fell out overnight from where the fragments had hit her scalp. But amazingly, physically, mostly unharmed, but mentally and emotionally, the long road ahead.
Yeah. What one can only hope that by telling her story, her dream would come true, that, people would understand what it is like to go through a school shooting. Sadly, the precedent has not been set in the United States, and so we continue to press on gun legislation and continue to press lawmakers on what happens next. Nora, thank you for that. Nora News talking about an 11-year-old there, describing what happened on Tuesday at Robb Elementary School. Let's bring in CNN's crime and justice correspondent Shimon Prokopets, who's outside that school. And we've just been listening to Mia's story, and I guess it's Mia who will help piece together exactly what happened on Tuesday. There is an awful lot of confusion and anger because there are still so many unanswered questions. What are you learning at this point?
Yeah, the key here is that hour. There's an hour that police say that the gunman was inside this classroom in the morning from 11:44 to 12:44 alone with these students, with these children, and it's not clear why police did not make every effort to break through that door to take out the gunman and rescue the children who we're hearing from now. Some of them were hiding under tables. You know, the one that we spoke to just recently, talking about how she had to fake her own death. The other survivors, we don't know what the condition was of all of the children who were injured and shot, but just the scars, the psychological scars on these children, and the fact that they had to endure this for so long. Answers are needed for these families because right now police are not telling us what were they doing in that hour. Yes, they called for reinforcement, for the tactical teams to come in, but what efforts were they making to try and get through that door to take out the gunman? So we hope to hear some answers here in the next hour, where police will answer some questions. They have given us bad information, wrong information, where they said that a police officer, a school police officer, was here in the beginning and had some kind of confrontation with the gunman. They revealed yesterday that was not the case, so we need to understand why that happened, why there wasn't this officer. And then also there was an unlocked door, a door that the gunman was able to get in through that should have been locked, and any new information on that. So certainly a lot of questions here, one of them being the tactics here, the tactics that police were using and what it is that they were doing and why it is that they were waiting so long to try and get inside that classroom.
Shimon, thank you. Well, many are outraged as the divisive gun lobbying group, the NRA, goes ahead, full steam ahead, with its annual convention in Texas, just hours from where that mass shooting took place. And first of its kind reporting, a report looking into the atrocities carried out by Russian forces in Ukraine, and the conclusions are frankly damning. I'll speak to a contributor to that report after this short break. Stay with us.
Afghan women are afraid that this is the beginning of your efforts to erase them from the workspace.
It's not clear. Even if we appear with the burqa, maybe they will say that women's voices are forbidden.
Did you ever imagine that you would be prevented from going to school?
Girls' education is fundamental to the dignity of Afghan life.
Do you believe that young girls will be allowed to go to school here in Afghanistan?
I'm James Roby. I'm the Global Head of Environmental Sustainability at Capgemini. People often ask, why should businesses care about sustainability? Well, first of all, quite frankly, an unsustainable pathway is not going to be good for any business. Businesses are reliant on having consumers that will buy from them. They're reliant on having employees who want to work for them. You know, increasingly, all the stakeholders of the business are asking difficult questions. So businesses which aren't taking sustainability seriously essentially are going to be out of business. But in reality, it's never too late to start. A great way to start is by trying to understand your own impacts as an organisation. Perhaps calculate your carbon footprint. Ultimately, we need everybody on this journey, so why not start today?
Out front tonight, a potential breakthrough in treating coronavirus.
We've gotten very little help from the federal government.
Could all this spending lead to a bigger economic crisis? One of our viewers saw you last night on the show. She says she's going to pay your rent this month. Shut up. I want to go now to an incredible story of survival. Would you do it all again in terms of being a nurse, knowing that that could put you at risk for this?
I want to help people more than I ever have.
Aaron Burnett out front on CNN.
Outnumbered and outgunned. That is how the Ukrainian military is describing the fight in eastern Ukraine. They are acknowledging the loss of some territory in Donetsk. You can see that on your screen in red, where the Russian offensive is centered. The forces are now focusing most of their efforts around the Severodonetsk region. Now, local officials say they are facing non-stop shelling. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the offensive is, quote, an obvious policy of genocide. He has repeatedly accused the Russian state of genocide during this war, but for the first time, an independent report by more than 30 international experts found that Kremlin propaganda, destruction of Ukrainian cultural sites, mass graves, forced relocations of Ukrainians and more pose a serious risk of genocide, triggering all states' obligations to act in order to prevent that under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. Well, I want to bring in Ewelina Ochab, and I hope I pronounced your name right, who is a contributor to the report and the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. It's very good to have you with us. The report says Ukrainians are at severe risk of genocide based on the Genocide Convention, which I just want to lay out for our viewers, which defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. The report found that based on Russia's actions, one can make the inference that they have been taken with the intent to destroy Ukrainians. It does, though, stop short of saying that Russia is committing genocide. So can you explain why that is?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here and for covering this important topic. The report makes two important findings. One is of incitement to commit genocide, and then of the serious risk of genocide. And at this stage, of course, we are talking about developments over the last 3 months and 3 days since the war. So, of course, it's very early still to make the findings of genocide. But ultimately, I think that the evidence explained in the report is very compelling. We are talking about propaganda and narrative that wanted to dehumanize the Ukrainians and destroy them as a nation. We've seen evidence, of course, over the last few months of mass killings, of the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war, of displacement of whole populations, displacement of children and placing them with Russian families. That's one of the allegations as well. So, of course, a lot of information will come in due course. Again, it's still very, very early, and we need to monitor the situation. But what is very important with this report is that it puts states on notice, that these are the findings at this very stage. What are we going to do about it? And also very important to note is that we don't have to wait until we see bodies on the streets, although we've seen bodies on the streets in Bucha and other places. But the duty under the Genocide Convention, the duty to prevent, is to be triggered at the very instance a state learns, or should have normally learned, of the serious risk of genocide. And this report is precisely about that, finding the serious risk of genocide, and now asking states to act. Now it is in your hands. You need to act to prevent the materialization of this risk into
and that's why the timing of this report is so important. And just to point out that CNN has actually confirmed much or many of the events and the evidence of atrocities that you have outlined in this report. One of the most chilling aspects of this report was the direct comparison to the 1995 Srebrenica massacre. The details, you say, of the mass murder of over 7,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men in Srebrenica only emerged before the international community when it was too late to prevent a genocide that occurred in a matter of days. In 2022, we have the capabilities to accurately track similar atrocities as they unfold and respond accordingly. So, what needs to be done next to stop that?
Of course, there are many actions that can be taken by states, but just going back to the duty to prevent, and I mentioned that the trigger for it is precisely now, when we see the serious risk of genocide. So states have to take all means reasonable available to them to prevent this genocide so far as possible. So we of course, sometimes will hear from states that whatever they do, it's not going to change what's going to happen, but that's not the point.
So what can they do?
Of course, they could. Some of the steps have been already taken. For example, some legal steps with the idea that will, to some extent, prevent further atrocities. But ultimately, of course, engaging in diplomatic dialogue, supporting the Ukrainian government as well in the fight against the crime of aggression. That
much of which, of course, is being done.
Of course.
So I guess, as we've pointed out, the importance of this report cannot be understated. The question is, what more can be done at this stage? Do you envision a world in which Vladimir Putin stands trial for these alleged acts of horror and war crimes?
Of course, many actors are working on it right now. We know that the International Criminal Court is working on the atrocities. We know that, of course, there are attempts to establish an ad hoc tribunal for the crime of aggression. We know, of course, that there are domestic prosecutions as well happening right now in Ukraine, and also at least 6 countries are working on using the principle of universal jurisdiction to ensure prosecution of the crime. So that there's a lot happening. But just going back to what you just said, that of course a lot is already happening from the steps that should be taken. Yes, but the interest is dropping as well. And we are now in 3 months, 3 days into this war, and we are seeing less and less coverage of the situation. It doesn't mean that the situation is improving. Definitely not. The humanitarian crisis is even getting worse.
In fact, it may be getting worse. I mean, you're not seeing less on CNN, by the way, but I understand what you're saying. There is, and we've been talking about this, you know, there is a war fatigue.
Definitely. And of course, then we'll move to something else. That's what happens with every case of genocidal atrocities, but also other atrocity crimes. We move from one case to another, and we never continue with the focus on those situations. We just drop them and move to something else. And of course, there will be something else after Ukraine. We know that. And also the comparison with Srebrenica, the very point of it is that we are in this unique situation right now. We can still prevent materialization of this genocide, but we need to act. We cannot leave it hoping that it's going to get better. There is no hope for that. I think we've seen it over the last few weeks and months. We need to act, and we need to act now.
It's good to have you on.
Thank you very much.
The report makes, sadly, very compelling reading. When we come back, a 10-year-old terrified to go back to school after he had to hide in a classroom while a gunman killed his friends. His story is up next.
Wherever you go in the world, one airline goes further to make it feel exceptional. Qatar Airways, going places together.
It is actually very complicated to move money around the world. Few companies can do it at scale. Few companies can do it in the number of countries that we do it. And so these companies that come together, like MoneyGrams and like our competitors, do really provide a very unique service, and that is to instantly move money, get funds from the United States to Mexico, literally in sub-seconds. For the ability to take $350 that you worked hard to earn and get it back to your mother, so that she can pick it up in Mexico, use it for food, healthcare, housing, is actually a very unique service. If you're from many of the countries, Mexico, Philippines, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some of the largest receive markets in the world, it's absolutely critical to the lives of the consumers in those countries. But many people don't appreciate that. If it's not the life that you live, then it's not something that you really ever really get involved in.
I'm Nick Robertson in Helsinki, and this is CNN.
Well, just days after 19 children and 2 teachers were gunned down in an elementary school, the National Rifle Association's annual convention will go ahead as planned this weekend in the same state as that school shooting, Texas. Among those who are expected to speak, former President Donald Trump and Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Texas Governor Greg Abbott will also send a pre-recorded video. At least 4 musicians, though, have cancelled their performances at the convention, and we are expecting to see protests as members of the gun lobby meet. Let's go straight to CNN correspondent Camilla Bernal, who is outside the convention centre in Houston, in Texas, where the NRA is holding the event. As I understand it, there are already protests locally. Just explain the atmosphere where you are.
Well, look, Becky, there were a lot of people who wanted this convention to be canceled, and there were others who said, let's postpone it and wait a little bit and then have the convention. But it is already underway. As you can see here behind me, there's already a line at the convention center. They're going in. There is one member of the NRA that I talked to who told me, look, I feel bad. I think it's horrible what happened in Texas, but I also am very excited for this convention. But then directly across the street from the convention, there is a green space, and this is where some of the protesters are going to gather throughout the day. There's a small group at the moment, and it's hard to see because there's still a little bit of protesters and a lot of cameras and media here at the moment, but they're carrying crosses with pictures of every child that was shot in Uvalde, and they say they will continue to be here throughout the day. Among some of the protesters that we're expecting later on today is Beto O'Rourke. He is the gubernatorial Democratic candidate for the state of Texas, and a lot of the organizers have told me, look, we are not only expressing our frustration, our anger, but we also are hoping to register people to vote. The city of Houston has said that they're going to keep things as safe as possible. They're going to have 2 zones, the protesters and then the counter protesters. Sylvester Turner, the mayor of Houston, said, look, I cannot cancel this event, but he is saying that he hopes that politicians pull out of the event, especially those publicly elected. Here's what else he had to say.
Even though the city cannot cancel a contract because we don't agree with their position on guns, certainly the NRA can postpone their convention for a week or 2 to allow the families to bury their children.
And of course, that is not happening. In terms of security inside of the event, because former President Donald Trump will be speaking tonight, it is Secret Service that will be in charge. And they say no guns will be allowed in that hall where President Trump will be speaking. Governor Greg Abbott was also supposed to speak today. He's sending a pre-recorded video because he is staying in Uvalde. There are other politicians that have pulled out, including Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, and Senator John Cornyn, also of Texas, who did not cite the shooting and instead cited a scheduling conflict. So we're seeing some people that are not going to be here while others are going on as planned, but still a lot of controversy around this year's convention. Becky?
And Camilla, there will be people watching this show who will think it is inconceivable that the narrative that the convention would be tone deaf to this school shooting. Is it clear what will be said, whether a moment of silence will be held? How is it clear how the organisers might cope with this jutting up as it is against such an awful, horrific event in the same state of Texas just earlier this week?
Yeah, I think we got a little preview of that from the statement that the NRA released earlier after the shooting, and they pointed to the one shooter. They pointed to one criminal and did not specifically talk about guns. Then they went on to say that they're going to continue to support safe schools. So I think that's where the message is going to go towards in terms of when we hear from NRA leadership. Of course, we won't know what happens until they actually do speak, but I think the focus is going to be on mental health, on the one shooter who is responsible for all of this, and then on possibly arming either teachers or guards or police who are at the schools. That's sort of the message that you're hearing from a lot of the Republicans and from the NRA, but of course we'll have to wait and see what happens later on this afternoon, and this goes on until Sunday, so we have a couple of days of all of these events and speakers. Becky?
As we say, Donald Trump, the former president, expected to be in attendance later this afternoon. Thank you. Well, Republican Senator Cruz, a key attendee at that conference, as Camilla mentioned, a clear opponent of what's known as common sense gun control. Less obvious are his alternative solutions to America's gun violence epidemic. And when asked by Sky News why only in America, he did this.
Why only in America? Why is this American exceptionalism so awful?
You know, I'm sorry you think American exceptionalism is awful.
I think this aspect of it.
You got your political agenda.
No, it's honestly,
God love you.
Senator, it's not. I just want to understand why you do not think that guns are the problem.
Why is this just an American problem?
Well, it is just an American problem, sir.
Well, one of the very real victims of America's gun problem, which is what it is fourth grader Jaden Perez. He had to see something no child should have to watch. His friends being killed as he hid from a gunman at his Texas elementary school Tuesday. Adrian Brodus spoke to Jaden and his mum about what happened that day.
Jaden Perez is better today.
Still sad about some of my friends that died.
And the 10-year-old shooting survivor says talking helps.
It was very terrifying because I never thought that was going to happen.
Inside a fourth grade classroom, the 10-year-old said he and his classmates hid near the backpacks. This photo of the classroom was taken long before the shooting.
5 of us hiding there and then the rest under a table. But that didn't stop one of my friends getting hurt. The shooter shot through the window and hurting my friend and my teacher. Like, my teacher got hurt on I don't know which side, but she got hit on the side, and then my friend got shot through the nose, and they both had to get surgery.
Perez said an officer helped him and his classmates escape through a window, but not before the shooter had killed his friends.
McKenna, Tess, Annabelle, basically almost all of them.
Jaden's pain, not physical, but emotionally paralyzing.
No, because after what happened, no.
Do you ever want to go back to school?
I don't want to know what, because I don't want anything to do with another shooting and me in the school.
You scared it might happen again?
Mm-hmm. And I know it might happen again, probably.
Jaden's mom, Crystal, shared these pictures taken about 90 minutes before the shooting. She's with her son at the school, celebrating Jaden's honor roll achievement. His mom said waiting, not knowing, was tough. What did you tell your mom when you finally saw her?
I left my water bottle at school.
Your water bottle. Did you hug her?
Mm-hmm. Or she hugged me first and she was like, "Oh!"
Was she so happy to see you?
Yes, and my dad and my grandma.
What do your parents mean to you?
A lot, because they brought me into this world.
A world where schools are also crime scenes. Did you hear the gunfire?
Yes, you never know whenever you can lose someone close to you.
Still ahead on Connect the World, friends amidst Russia's war on Ukraine. Will the close relationship between the Chinese and Russian leaders impact how China plans to deal with Taiwan? We're going to take a look at that and more after this.
we invite you with open arms to our wonderful country.
When you invest in people, you give them the opportunity to be more. With up to 20 million young people joining the African workforce each year, empowering the next generation has never been more important. Access Bank's Project LEAD has equipped over 90,000 students with leadership training. And our Pitchathon scheme invests in female entrepreneurs, helping them realize their vision. Access. More than banking.
16 months after moving into the White House, the Biden administration is spelling out its strategy towards China. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying in a speech on Thursday that China poses, and I quote him here, the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. To counter that, Blinken says the US will close ranks with its allies and will be ready to defend its interests. But he also says Washington doesn't want to start a new Cold War with China or change its political system. Instead, Blinken says the door is open to diplomacy.
This is a charged moment for the world. And at times like these, diplomacy is vital. It's how we make clear our profound concerns, better understand each other's perspective, and have no doubt about each other's intentions. We stand ready to increase our direct communication with Beijing across a full range of issues.
Well, in Beijing, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson said today that Blinken's speech smears China, and he repeated Beijing's long-held position that Taiwan, along with Hong Kong and Tibet, are purely internal affairs of China. Well, Ivan Watson tells us why the US fears that China will follow Russia's Ukraine playbook for dealing with Taiwan and why it might experience similar problems. Have a look at this.
Russia and China enjoy a friendship with no limits. This announcement made by the Russian and Chinese presidents when they met on February 4th on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics. 20 days later, soon after the end of the Olympics, Moscow invaded Ukraine. Russia's unprovoked war sparking fears China could have similar plans for Taiwan. Beijing claims the self-governing island belongs to China. Asked if he would get involved militarily to defend Taiwan against China, the U.S. president had this explicit warning.
Yes.
You are.
That's the commitment we made.
Beijing has long called for peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but it has also never ruled out using force against Taiwan's democratically elected government. And when it comes to military force, China dwarfs Taiwan, boasting the largest navy in the world and the largest air force in the region. But if Russia's deadly adventure in Ukraine taught strategists anything, it's that size doesn't always matter.
The country may clearly have a conventional military advantage over an adversary, but that doesn't mean that it would necessarily achieve easy military or political victory.
The war in Ukraine highlights another potential challenge for China. To attack Ukraine, Russian troops simply drove across the border from Russia and from neighboring Belarus. But to reach Taiwan, Chinese forces would have to cross the Taiwan Strait, more than 100 miles, 180 kilometers of open water.
Well, amphibious assaults are the most difficult complex operations in warfare. If the Chinese tried to send an invasion force from the mainland to Taiwan, they would have to contend with salvos of anti-ship missiles. And what we would see is a massacre of shipping, probably in the waters around Taiwan.
The Russian Navy has suffered major losses from suspected Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. First losing this landing ship in the Russian-occupied port of Berdyansk, and then losing the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Analysts say Taiwan has a much larger arsenal of anti-ship missiles at its disposal, and its military has been training for 70 years against the threat of a Chinese invasion.
China is learning the lessons from Ukraine, both in a positive and also in the negative manner.
Early in his Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin publicly put Russia's nuclear weapons on alert, a thinly veiled threat to the West.
Probably that the China will bring in the kind of advantage of the nuclear threats in the early phase of the scenario. That will potentially, I think, change the calculation of the Washington, D.C.
As a warning to the U.S., China's foreign ministry declared this week that no force in the world can stop China from achieving reunification with Taiwan. Ivan Watson, CNN, Hong Kong.
This is fascinating. Nick Robertson joining me now. Is this concern about Taiwan in that, Beijing may be taking a leaf out of the Ukraine playbook? Is this overplayed?
It's been President Biden's main concern when he first came to office, and it was, the Obama administration that had wanted to pivot to Asia because they saw the Chinese threat. And if you think about, last year we heard a lot from President Biden, and also we heard a lot under Trump as well, that European partners and allies really needed to rally to the U.S. position that China was not a good human rights actor, it was not a good trade partner, and that, this alignment of the United States and European countries on their view of China has sort of solidified post the Ukraine war. Not perhaps because of what China has done there, but because it solidified this concern that other autocracies around the world that cannot be trusted. So by Biden just last week, in the past week, going to Asia, going to South Korea, going to Japan to meet with allies there, that really signals that he still sees this as his major concern, that this is a real concern because this is China's path to challenging the United States. If they win on Taiwan, then the United States as a global power is diminished. It's the acid test.
It was interesting to hear Blinken really, lay out what the Biden administration's China policy is. I have to say, in listening to that, if you closed your eyes, there was a kind of, a whiff of Barack Obama in that, in the intonation, at least, of Blinken, if not in the narrative. It's one that we recognise. I have to say, I didn't think there was anything particularly new, but the Chinese, Beijing, have certainly seen it and heard it and are treating it as a smear. I wonder if we sort of move away from that speech and just look at activity. Yesterday at the UN Security Council, we saw China and Russia, for the first time, I think, in something like 15 years, veto sanctions which were suggested by the US on North Korea. We are seeing, in that activity, we are seeing the potential for the Chinese and the Russians to start, to all intents and purposes, working together to defeat proposals that the international community is putting on the table at this point. Do you expect to see more of that going forward?
I do. And quite simply, China several years ago has clearly taken the view that the West, the United States, and as many allies as it can bring, are trying to keep China back from its rightful place as potentially the world's major economy. It's not there yet, but as a major producer of real high tech, not the cheap products that China decades ago flooded the world market with.
And frankly, it feels like it's being dissed, right?
Completely. So, and the more they watch what's happening with the way the Western community deals with Russia, this reaffirms to them that their best response, it appears to be, is being robust. So yes, they're not going to be compliant and go along, even for a near neighbor that is potentially more of a troublesome threat to them in terms of North Korea, and a greater alignment with Russia. And if they can make Western policy in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, tougher by siding a bit or a lot, or appearing to side a lot with Russia, then this is in their interests. I mean, as much as there are lessons for them to draw from the way that the United States and the EU are dealing with Russia, this is a moment where China can signal its intent. And I think that's what we saw there at the UN Security Council. But we also saw it on Tuesday over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, where there was a joint strategic flight of Russian and Chinese bombers. And that was while President Biden was in Japan. It's all very strong and clear signaling. There is a polarizing of the world taking place, and where does one see those poles, that magnetic polar opposites so clearly? Where there are 5 key players around one table, the permanent 5 at the UN Security Council. That's what we're seeing.
Couldn't be more interesting to be the international diplomatic editor at CNN these days, could it?
I would say so.
Good job we've got him. Well, a car given by the former Shah of Iran to a Romanian dictator in the 1970s is now being used to raise awareness for the Iranian LGBTQ community. More on that after this.
Egypt is transitioning towards a sustainable, circular economy. Through the opening of the Gabal al-Asfar wastewater treatment plant, it is using treated water to irrigate agricultural land and is producing organic fertilizers. The plant has been designed to reduce waste and optimizes the use of water resources. It generates electricity and saves carbon emissions, ensuring that over 8 million people across the country live better, healthier lives.
South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, sits down with CNN in an exclusive interview, fresh from an international summit with US President Biden. See what this former prosecutor has to say about the threat of North Korea.
What would your message to Kim Jong-un be?
Plus, his thoughts on the new American-led economic pact to counter a rising China.
Are you anticipating a new kind of relationship with China?
Talk Asia, Saturday on CNN.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 80,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore cnn.com/impact. Click to take action.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
In tonight's Parting Shots, this year's Oslo Freedom Forum brought together human rights activists from around the world to shed light on the global struggle for freedom and democracy. One organisation working to raise awareness for the LGBTQ community in Iran received the 2022 Havel Prize for Creative Dissent. Have a look at this.
This is the first time that a foundation that has been focused on Iranian LGBT rights and issues is winning this prize. So we are all here to receive this prize on behalf of Hakan Art Card. Hakan card itself is such a national icon for any Iranian, so Iranians can really relate to this card very well. This particular card was a gift of Iranian's former Shah to the former dictator of Romania, and is using this card as a canvas to bring out human rights issues of marginalized people in Iran in art form. The artist has used traditional Iranian art to bring out the issues that relate to LGBT community. In the front of card, we see Sohrab and Shaban. There's always these war scenes about them, and we see art pieces of them. And instead of fighting, they're making love in front of the car. On one side, we see Shaban with a noose around his neck, which represents the death penalty that gay men face in Iran. And on the other side of the car, with the door being ajar, we see blood dripping out of Sohrab's neck, which actually is referring to beheading of Alireza Mofared, who was beheaded by his own family members in Iran because of being gay. And we have a voice that LGBT people inside Iran don't have. We need to extend our political privileges to create a space to be the voice of those people and give them a space to be able to talk about their issues.
Well, sticking with Iran, before we end this show, its cinema scene has garnered international fame. So let's take a look at 2 Iranian movies that have made the coveted final selection at the Cannes Film Festival this year. Holy Spider by Iran-born director Ali Abbasi is inspired by the true story of a serial killer who targeted sex